The year is 1847. Dust devils danced across the parched land of the American West, mirroring the loneliness that clung to Tobias Hartwell like a second skin. His ranch, a small, struggling spread carved out of the unforgiving territory, was his sanctuary and his prison. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the rising and setting sun, the bleating of a few scrawny cattle, and the creak of the windmill that stubbornly drew water from the earth. Tobias was a man of few words and fewer comforts. He'd come west seeking a fresh start, hoping to bury the ghosts of a past he rarely spoke of. The vast, empty landscape offered a kind of solace, a place where a man could lose himself in the endless horizon. He was a sturdy figure, weathered and worn, with eyes that held both a quiet sadness and a surprising spark of determination. His calloused hands told the story of hard labor, of battling the elements and coaxing life from the dry soil. His days were filled with the monotonous rhythm of ranch work, mending fences, tending to the cattle, and ensuring the well never ran dry. The nearest town, a dusty collection of saloons and trading posts, was a day's ride away, and Tobias rarely ventured there. He preferred the company of the land, the silent understanding of the wind and the sun. He wasn't a man who went looking for trouble, but trouble, it seemed, had a way of finding him. The whispers of conflict between settlers and Native American tribes echoed, even in his remote corner of the world. He'd heard tales of raids and skirmishes, of broken treaties and simmering resentment. He tried to remain neutral, focusing on his own survival, but he knew that the fragile peace couldn't last forever. He knew the land he stood on was once someone else's. He sometimes wondered if the ghosts of those people were as lonely as he was. He kept to himself, hoping that the troubles of the world would pass him by. He wasn't a hero, just a man trying to make a life for himself in a harsh and unforgiving land. One sweltering afternoon, the sun beat down with merciless intensity. Tobias, his brow furrowed with concentration, was inspecting the well. It was the lifeblood of his ranch, and any sign of trouble sent a shiver of anxiety through him. As he leaned over the stone wall, squinting into the depths, he noticed something unusual. A figure lay sprawled near the base of the well, partially hidden by the sparse vegetation. He cautiously approached, his hand instinctively reaching for the worn revolver holstered at his hip. As he drew closer, he realized it was a man, an Indian warrior, judging by the tattered remnants of his clothing and the eagle feather woven into his long, dark hair. The warrior was clearly wounded, a crimson stain blooming on his side. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. Tobias hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to leave the warrior to his fate. This was Indian territory, and helping him could bring untold trouble. The stories he'd heard painted the Native Americans as ruthless savages, enemies to be feared and avoided. But something in the warrior's still face, a vulnerability that transcended the stereotypes, stayed Tobias's hand. He knew the risks. Harboring an Indian, especially a wounded one, was a dangerous proposition. It could bring the wrath of the settlers, the law, and even other tribes. But as he looked at the man lying helpless in the dirt, he couldn't bring himself to leave him there to die. The same ghost that haunted him knew what it was like to be left for dead. He glanced around, scanning the horizon for any sign of approaching riders. The land was empty, silent save for the buzzing of insects and the distant cry of a hawk. He made his decision. He quickly knelt beside the warrior, his weathered hands gently probing the wound. It looked serious, but not immediately life-threatening. Dehydration was the more pressing concern. Tobias carefully lifted the warrior's head and trickled a few drops of water from his canteen into his parched lips. The warrior groaned softly, his eyelids fluttering. Tobias continued to offer small sips, watching intently for any reaction. Slowly, the warrior began to regain consciousness, his dark eyes opening with a mixture of confusion and pain. The fate of both men was about to change forever, all because of a few drops of water offered in the scorching heat. The first few days were a delicate dance of suspicion and tentative trust. Tobias moved the warrior, now identified as Ayanna, to a small, hidden room behind the main house, a space he usually used for storing tools and supplies. It wasn't much, but it offered a degree of privacy and protection. Ayanna was weak, feverish, and initially wary. He spoke little English, but Tobias, through gestures and a few broken words he'd picked up over the years, managed to communicate the basics: food, water, rest. He cleaned and bandaged Ayanna's wound, using herbs he'd learned about from his own mother, a skill he hadn't thought he'd ever need again. The silence between them was thick, punctuated only by Ayanna's labored breathing and the creaks of the old house. Tobias brought him simple meals: stewed beans, dried meat, and fresh water. He noticed Ayanna ate sparingly, his eyes always watchful, assessing the situation. Tobias didn't press him. He understood the warrior's caution. He would be suspicious too. He just continued to offer what he could, hoping to earn Ayanna's trust. He knew that if Ayanna was going to survive, he needed to eat. As Ayanna slowly regained his strength, the tension in the small room began to ease. He started to offer small gestures of gratitude, a nod of the head, a slight smile. He began trying out some English words, repeating them carefully, testing their sounds. Tobias responded in kind, correcting his pronunciation and teaching him new phrases. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Ayanna spoke for the first time at length. His voice was raspy, but his words were clear. He told Tobias his name, Ayanna, which meant shining light in his native tongue. He spoke of his people, the Apache, and their struggle to survive in a world that seemed determined to erase them. He spoke of broken promises and stolen lands. And in his eyes, Tobias saw not the savage monster he'd been taught to fear, but a man, a warrior, fighting for his people and his way of life. Tobias listened, his own past wounds aching in recognition. He knew what it was like to lose everything, to be driven from your home, to be forced to fight for survival. He saw a reflection of himself in Ayanna's story, a shared understanding that transcended language and culture. And in that moment, he knew that helping Ayanna was more than just an act of compassion. It was an act of defiance, a stand against the darkness that threatened to consume them both. The decision to help Ayanna wasn't one Tobias took lightly. He knew the potential consequences, the danger he was inviting into his already precarious existence. But something deep inside him, a flicker of long-dormant humanity, wouldn't let him turn away. He saw in Ayanna's eyes a reflection of his own pain, his own struggle for survival in a world that often seemed indifferent to suffering. He remembered his own past, the hardships he had endured, the times when he had been left to fend for himself. He knew what it was like to be an outsider, to be judged and mistreated simply because of who you were. He couldn't condemn another man to that same fate. He understood that his actions were likely foolish, perhaps even reckless. He was a simple rancher, not a politician or a hero. He had no grand ambitions, no desire to change the world. He just wanted to be left alone to live his life in peace. But sometimes doing the right thing meant sacrificing your own comfort, your own safety. He reinforced the hidden room, adding extra layers of wood to the walls and reinforcing the door. He moved his rifle and ammunition closer, preparing for the worst. He knew that it was only a matter of time before someone came looking for Ayanna. The whispers of the outside world had a way of seeping into even the most isolated corners of the West. He started teaching Ayanna more English, focusing on phrases that would help him if he were discovered. I am injured. I need help. I mean no harm. He drilled him on these phrases, repeating them over and over until Ayanna's pronunciation was almost perfect. He knew that if Ayanna were captured, his ability to communicate could be the difference between life and death. He also began to learn more about Apache culture, about their customs and beliefs. Ayanna shared stories of his people, of their connection to the land, of their respect for nature. Tobias was surprised to find that he had more in common with Ayanna than he did with many of the settlers he had encountered. He started to question the prejudices he had held for so long, the stereotypes that had been ingrained in him, since childhood. As the days passed, Tobias realized that he wasn't just helping Iona, he was helping himself. He was rediscovering a part of himself that he had thought long lost, a sense of purpose, a reason to believe in something beyond his own survival. He was no longer just a lonely rancher, struggling to eke out a living in the wilderness. He was a protector, a friend, an ally, and that, he realized, was a life worth fighting for. One night, as they sat by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, Iona finally revealed the full extent of his plight. He was not just any Apache warrior. He was a key negotiator in upcoming peace talks between the settlers and several Native American tribes. These talks, set to take place in a few weeks, were crucial, perhaps the last chance to avert a full-scale war that would engulf the entire territory. But powerful forces were working against peace. Iona explained that a faction of unscrupulous settlers, driven by greed and a lust for land, wanted to sabotage the treaty and ignite a conflict that would allow them to seize even more territory from the Native Americans. He believed they were the ones who had ambushed him and framed him for the murder of a prominent settler leader, a crime he swore he did not commit. He told Tobias that he'd been on his way to meet with other tribal leaders to finalize the peace agreement when he was attacked. The ambushers had left him for dead, hoping to eliminate a key voice for peace and plunge the region into chaos. He'd managed to escape, but his injuries were severe, and he knew he couldn't outrun his pursuers for long. Iona explained that the murder he was accused of had taken place near the town of Redemption, a lawless place where justice was often a matter of who had the fastest gun. He believed that the sheriff of Redemption, a corrupt man named Barlow, was involved in the conspiracy and was actively hunting him down. He knew that if he were captured, he would be given a sham trial and hanged, effectively silencing him and destroying any hope for peace. He showed Tobias a small, intricately carved wooden token, a symbol of the peace agreement that he carried with him at all times. He said that this token was proof of his commitment to peace and that it could be used to convince others of his innocence. He entrusted the token to Tobias, asking him to keep it safe, even if it meant risking his own life. Tobias listened in stunned silence, his mind reeling from the implications of Iona's story. He realized that he had stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. He was no longer just helping a wounded warrior. He was protecting a key figure in a desperate struggle for peace. And the stakes, he knew, couldn't be higher. The fate of the entire West, it seemed, rested on his shoulders. The tranquility of Tobias's ranch was shattered one dusty morning by the thunder of approaching hooves. He peered through a crack in the wooden wall, his heart pounding in his chest. A group of riders was approaching, led by a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm cloud, Marshal Webb. Webb was a hard man, a lawman known for his brutal methods and unwavering commitment to justice, as he saw it. He was a tall, imposing figure with a weathered face, cold blue eyes, and a scar that snaked across his left cheek. He carried himself with an air of authority that brooked no argument, and his reputation for violence was well-earned. Tobias knew that Webb was Sheriff Barlow's man, a puppet used to enforce his corrupt agenda. If Webb was here, it could only mean one thing. They were looking for Iona. The net was closing in. He quickly turned to Iona, who was already awake and alert, his senses honed by years of living in the wilderness. "They're here," Tobias whispered, his voice tight with anxiety. "Webb's leading them." Iona nodded grimly, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife hidden beneath his blanket. "We fight," he said, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. Tobias knew that fighting was a last resort. They were outnumbered and outgunned. But he also knew that they couldn't let Webb take Iona without a fight. The fate of the peace treaty, and perhaps the entire West, depended on it. He positioned Iona in the hidden room, ensuring he had a clear line of sight through a small opening in the wall. He handed him his rifle, a Winchester repeater that he had kept meticulously maintained over the years. "Use it wisely," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Only when you have to." Tobias then took a deep breath and walked out into the yard, bracing himself for the confrontation. As he stepped into the sunlight, he saw Webb and his men dismounting, their faces grim and determined. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The showdown was about to begin. Webb strode forward, his spurs clinking against the dry earth. His eyes, cold and piercing, fixed on Tobias. "Hartwell," he said, his voice gravelly and devoid of warmth. "We're looking for an Indian. Heard he might be holed up here." Tobias met Webb's gaze, his own expression carefully neutral. "You heard wrong, Marshal. I haven't seen any Indians around here." He knew it was a lie, but he had to buy Ayanna some time. Webb's eyes narrowed. "Don't play coy with me, Hartwell. We know he's here. Save yourself some trouble and hand him over." Tobias stood his ground. "I told you, I haven't seen him. Now, if you don't mind, I have work to do." Webb chuckled, a harsh, humorless sound. "You're protecting him? You know harboring a fugitive is a crime, Hartwell." "I'm protecting my property, Marshal," Tobias replied, his voice firm. "Now, get off my land." Webb signaled to his men, who spread out, surrounding the ranch house. "We'll search the place," he said. "You can cooperate, or we can do this the hard way." As Webb's men began their search, tearing through Tobias's meager belongings, Ayanna, hidden in the back room, knew that time was running out. He had to act, but he couldn't risk exposing himself unless it was absolutely necessary. Tobias watched in simmering anger as Webb's men ransacked his home, their disrespect a violation of everything he held dear. He knew that they wouldn't find anything incriminating in the main house, but he also knew that they wouldn't give up easily. They would search every inch of his property until they found Ayanna. Just as Webb's men were about to search the outbuildings, Ayanna made his move. He burst out of the back room, his rifle raised, and fired a shot into the air. The sound echoed across the barren landscape, silencing Webb's men and drawing their attention to the hidden room. "Hold it right there," Ayanna shouted in surprisingly clear English. "I am Ayanna. I am the man you seek." He knew he was revealing himself, but he had no choice. He couldn't let Tobias take the fall for him. Webb's eyes widened in surprise. Well, he said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Looks like we flushed him out. Get him." The standoff had begun. The fate of Ayanna, Tobias, and the fragile peace treaty now hung precariously in the balance. The air crackled with tension, the silence broken only by the rustling of the wind and the pounding of their hearts. The next few moments would determine everything. Webb's men surged forward, their guns drawn. But before they could reach Ayanna, Tobias stepped in front of him, raising his hands in a gesture of defiance. "Hold it," he shouted, his voice ringing with unexpected authority. "You're making a mistake." Webb sneered. "Get out of the way, Hartwell. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when you're about to arrest an innocent man," Tobias retorted. He knew he was taking a huge risk, but he couldn't stand by and watch Ayanna be dragged away to a certain death. "Innocent," Webb scoffed. "He's wanted for murder. He was framed," Tobias insisted. "He's a key figure in the upcoming peace talks. There are people who want to see those talks fail, and they're using Ayanna as a scapegoat." Webb hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. He wasn't a stupid man, and he knew that there were powerful forces at play in the West, forces that often operated outside the law. But he was also a lawman, sworn to uphold the law, and Ayanna was wanted for murder. "That's a pretty story, Hartwell," Webb said, his voice laced with skepticism. "But I have a warrant for his arrest. I have to take him in." "Then listen to him," Tobias pleaded. "Let him tell you the truth. He can prove his innocence." Webb considered Tobias's words, his eyes shifting back and forth between Tobias and Ayanna. He knew that if he ignored Tobias's plea, he would be setting a dangerous precedent, condoning the framing of an innocent man. But he also knew that if he listened to Ayanna, he would be defying Sheriff Barlow, a man who wielded considerable power in the region. "All right," Webb said finally, his voice barely audible. "I'll listen, but if I hear one lie, one word out of place, I'm taking him in." "Understood," Ayanna nodded, his eyes locking with Webb's. "I understand," he said. "I will tell you the truth." And so, under the scorching sun, with the fate of the peace treaty hanging in the balance, Ayanna began to tell his story, revealing the conspiracy that threatened to plunge the West into war. As he spoke, the lawmen listened, their faces etched with disbelief and growing unease. The truth, it seemed, was far more complicated and dangerous than they had ever imagined. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and the loyalty of Webb's men would be tested to their limits. As Ayanna finished his story, a heavy silence descended upon the ranch. Webb's men shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between Ayanna and Webb. The truth was a dangerous thing, and it had just thrown their world into chaos. Webb, his face grim, remained silent for a long moment, weighing his options. He knew that if Ayanna's story was true, Sheriff Barlow was involved in a conspiracy that could have devastating consequences for the entire West. But he also knew that defying Barlow would be a dangerous move, one that could cost him his job, his reputation, and perhaps even his life. He looked at Tobias, his eyes searching for some sign, some indication of what he should do. He knew that Tobias was an honest man, a man of few words but unwavering principles. If Tobias believed Ayanna, then there had to be some truth to his story. "What do you say, Hartwell?" Webb asked, his voice barely audible. "Do you believe it?" All eyes turned to Tobias. He knew that his answer could determine the fate of Ayanna, the peace treaty, and perhaps even the entire region. He looked at Ayanna, his face etched with hope and desperation. He looked at Webb, his eyes filled with uncertainty and doubt. And then he looked at his own past, at the choices he had made, at the man he had become. He took a deep breath and met Webb's gaze. "I believe him," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "I know Ayanna. He's not a murderer. He's a warrior, a leader, a man of peace." Webb's eyes narrowed. "You're choosing a side, Hartwell. You know what this means?" "I know exactly what it means," Tobias replied. "I'm choosing the side of truth. I'm choosing the side of justice. I'm choosing the side of peace." Webb nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He turned to his men, his voice ringing with authority. "All right," he said, "we're going to redemption. We're going to find out the truth about this murder." A murmur of dissent rippled through the ranks. Some of Webb's men were loyal to Barlow, and they didn't like the idea of questioning their sheriff. But Webb silenced them with a withering glare. "I'm still the marshal," he said, his voice cold and hard, "and you will follow my orders. Anyone who doesn't like it can leave." Now, no one moved. Webb had made his choice, and his men, however reluctantly, would follow him. The dramatic standoff had shifted, and a new path was being forged. But the journey to redemption would be fraught with danger, and the truth, they knew, would come at a price. As Webb prepared to leave for redemption, Tobias knew he couldn't stay behind. He had made his choice, and he had to see it through to the end. He had to defend Ayanna and expose the conspiracy, even if it meant risking everything. "I'm coming with you," Tobias said, his voice firm. Webb raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to do this, Hartwell. This is a dangerous business." "I know," Tobias replied, "but I can't just stand by and watch. Ayanna needs my help, and so does the West." Webb nodded slowly, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "All right," he said, "you're welcome to come, but you'll have to follow my orders. This is my investigation, and I'm in charge." "Agreed," Tobias said. He knew that he would have to trust Webb, at least for now. But he also knew that he had to be prepared to act on his own if necessary. As they prepared to leave, Ayanna approached Tobias, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Tobias," he said. "You're a true friend." "We're in this together, Ayanna," Tobias replied. "We'll get through this." They mounted their horses and joined Webb and his men, forming a small, determined posse. As they rode towards redemption, the sun beat down on their backs, and the dust swirled around them. The journey would be long and arduous, and they knew that they would face many dangers along the way. As they rode, Tobias thought about his past, about the choices he had made, about the man he had become. He had always tried to avoid trouble, to keep to himself, to live a quiet life. But now he was riding headfirst into danger, fighting for a cause that was bigger than himself. He realized that he had been wrong to try to isolate himself from the world. He had been wrong to let his fears and his prejudices control his life. He had been given a second chance, a chance to make a difference, a chance to fight for what was right. And he wasn't going to waste it. He was going to defend Iona, expose the conspiracy, and help bring peace to the West. He was going to be a hero, not because he wanted to be, but because he had to be. The fate of the West depended on it. He knew in his heart that this was the right path, and he would see it through, no matter the cost. The journey to redemption had begun, and there was no turning back. The ride to redemption was fraught with tension. Webb's men, divided in their loyalties, kept a wary distance from Iona, their faces etched with suspicion. But Tobias, riding alongside Iona, offered him a silent reassurance, a bond forged in the crucible of shared adversity. As they approached the town, they could feel the atmosphere change. Redemption was a lawless place, a haven for outlaws and opportunists. The streets were filled with rough-looking characters, their eyes filled with greed and suspicion. The air crackled with a palpable sense of danger. Webb led his posse to the sheriff's office, a dilapidated building that seemed to reflect the corruption that festered within. Sheriff Barlow, a fat, greasy man with a cruel smile, greeted them with a feigned cordiality. "Marshal Webb," Barlow said, his voice oily and insincere. "What brings you to redemption?" "I'm here to investigate the murder of Jedediah Smith," Webb replied, his voice cold and formal. Barlow's smile faltered. "That's already been taken care of. We have the killer in custody, an Indian named Iona." Webb's eyes narrowed. "I know all about Iona, Sheriff. I'm here to find out the truth." Barlow scoffed. "The truth is, he's a savage murderer. He deserves to hang." "Maybe," Webb said, "but I intend to find out for myself." Webb and his men began their investigation, questioning witnesses, examining evidence, and piecing together the events that had led to Smith's death. As they dug deeper, they began to uncover a web of lies and deceit, a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of redemption society. Tobias, working alongside Webb, proved to be an invaluable ally. He had a keen eye for detail and an unwavering determination to find the truth. He also had a way of connecting with people, of earning their trust, even in a town as corrupt as Redemption. Together, Tobias and Webb uncovered evidence that implicated Barlow and several prominent citizens in Smith's murder. They discovered that Smith had been about to expose Barlow's illegal land grab scheme, a scheme that would have cheated many settlers out of their property. Barlow had silenced Smith to protect his own interests, and he had framed Iona to ignite a war that would allow him to seize even more land. With the evidence in hand, Webb confronted Barlow, exposing his crimes to the town. A tense standoff ensued, with Webb and his men facing off against Barlow and his cronies. But in the end, justice prevailed. Barlow was arrested, and his conspiracy was revealed. As the dust settled, Iona was exonerated, his name cleared. The truth had prevailed, and the peace treaty had been saved. In the aftermath, a powerful alliance was forged between Tobias and Iona, a bond of friendship and respect that transcended race and culture. They had fought together, risked their lives together, and emerged victorious together. They were brothers, bound by a shared commitment to justice and peace. The alliance between them would serve as a beacon of hope for a divided West. With Iona's name cleared and Barlow behind bars, the stage was set for the peace treaty to move forward. Iona, his reputation restored, traveled to the designated meeting place, carrying with him the wooden token that had almost cost him his life. The peace talks were tense and difficult, with deep-seated distrust and resentment on both sides. But Iona, with his wisdom, his eloquence, and his unwavering commitment to peace, was able to bridge the divide. He spoke of shared humanity, of the need for understanding and compassion, and of the devastating consequences of war. He presented the wooden token, a symbol of unity and cooperation, and urged the settlers and the Native American tribes to put aside their differences and work together for a better future. His words resonated with the assembled leaders, and slowly, grudgingly, they began to listen. Tobias, who had accompanied Iona to the peace talks, watched with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had played a small part in this momentous occasion, and he was proud to have stood by Iana's side. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew that peace was possible if people were willing to work for it. After days of intense negotiations, a peace treaty was finally signed, a historic agreement that promised to bring an end to the long-standing conflict between the settlers and the Native American tribes. The treaty established clear boundaries, guaranteed the rights of both sides, and created a framework for future cooperation. The signing of the treaty was met with celebrations and relief throughout the West. The threat of war had been averted, and a new era of peace and prosperity had begun. But Tobias knew that the treaty was only the first step. The real challenge would be to implement the agreement and to build trust between the settlers and the Native Americans. He resolved to dedicate himself to this task, to work tirelessly to promote understanding and cooperation between the two cultures. He knew that it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to make a difference. He had seen the power of compassion, the strength of friendship, and the importance of fighting for what was right. And he was ready to continue the fight, to build a better future for the West, a future where peace and justice prevailed. The peace treaty was salvaged, and a new chapter in the history of the West had begun. Months later, Tobias stood beneath the vast, starlit sky, surrounded by the rhythmic beat of drums and the soaring voices of the Apache people. He had been invited to Iana's village, a place hidden deep within the mountains, a sanctuary of tradition and community. He had come as a friend, an ally, and a brother. During a solemn ceremony, Iana's tribe offered Tobias the greatest honor they could bestow, adoption into the Apache nation. The tribal elders spoke of Tobias's courage, his compassion, and his unwavering commitment to justice. He spoke of the bond that had formed between Tobias and Iana, a bond that transcended race and culture. He declared that Tobias would henceforth be known as Walks with Light, a name that reflected his inner goodness and his ability to bring hope to a divided world. The tribe cheered, their voices filled with warmth and acceptance. Tobias, his heart filled with gratitude, accepted the honor with humility and grace. He knew that he could never truly become Apache, but he vowed to honor their traditions, to respect their way of life, and to stand by their side in times of need. He donned the traditional Apache clothing, a symbol of his new identity, and joined in the dance, his movements awkward but heartfelt. As he danced, he looked at Iana, his eyes filled with emotion. They had come so far, overcome so many obstacles, and forged a bond that would last a lifetime. They were brothers, bound by a shared commitment to peace and justice. In the days and weeks that followed, Tobias learned more about Apache culture, about their customs, their beliefs, and their connection to the land. He learned to hunt, to track, and to survive in the wilderness. He learned the Apache language, and he began to understand their way of thinking. He also shared his own knowledge and experiences with the Apache people. He taught them about farming, about ranching, and about the ways of the settlers. He helped them to build bridges of understanding and cooperation between the two cultures. Tobias's adoption into the Apache nation became a symbol of hope for understanding and lasting peace in the West. It showed that people from different backgrounds could come together, overcome their prejudices, and build a better future for all. It proved that compassion, courage, and